Since it's literally in the name, Oppenheimer will be opening this list at number 10. Yeah, you can hate me in the comments for that one. So, born into a bread and butter white picket fence family in 1904, J. Robert Oppenheimer's bland start fueled his drive for knowledge, and he excelled in a broad range of subjects. He earned a Harvard degree in 1925 and a doctorate from Göttingen in 1927, and he took on a joint position between Caltech and Berkeley in 1930. The bulk of Oppenheimer's work during these eras of his life focused on the blossoming field of quantum mechanics, specifically experimental nuclear physics. The fall of France in 1940 horrified him, and he felt a deep obligation to join the American forces as a result. Oppenheimer was appointed the leader of the Manhattan Project in early 1942 and began searching for the brightest nuclear physicists, chemists, and engineers in the United States. What makes Oppenheimer a mad scientist isn't the fact that he achieved probably the only technological achievement that rivaled the computer using only theoretical principles since they were too broke for real supplies. It was actually A, he recognized what they were creating and the extent of it, but proceeded to because he felt it was the right thing to do to take vengeance. B, the misconception he regrets dropping that thing. He doesn't. As stated, Oppenheimer felt it was a correct for vengeance. He does, however, regret creating something that began the arms race of all arms race and encouraged bigger and more deadly weaponry that humanity wouldn't understand the extent of nor be able to control. And C, he chose a test site, aka Trinity, for the NB that was populated by indigenous people. It was not unpopulated, and the film is actually perpetuating this inaccuracy. The Trinity site is more than 200 miles away from Los Alamos and White Sands, New Mexico, and what people weren't forced off their land for a mere $7 from the government were still there when the NB was tested. If I have to explain to you why that warrants being dubbed a mad scientist, we got some other problems here. Alright, well, that's a bummer to start with. Let's try and lighten things up with number 9, alien seedlings. See, doesn't that sound so promising? But it starts off relatively normal at first. So, along with James D. Watson, Francis Crick will forever be remembered as one of the discoverers of the very structure of DNA. February 28th of 1953, which made Crick climb up out of his seat and declare to the assembled lunch patrons at the Eagle that they had found the secret of life. The two men had met while they were working together at the University of Cambridge, and in 1962 they received a Nobel Prize for their scientific work. A coin toss between the two of them had decided the order in which they would even be named as authors. But you can learn more about this in the Bumblebee video, the top 10 most significant scientific breakthroughs in history, and maybe while you're at it, subscribe to The Hive to see more of the Bumblebee science videos. Anyways, Crick was arguably amongst the finest minds in science, which is what makes his later beliefs a little bit more difficult to fathom. At some point in the 1970s, Crick became an advocate of one of the weirdo pseudoscience theories of all time. He called it direct panspermia, and it's the premises that life on Earth was deliberately seeded by aliens. However, this theory states how life spread, not how life began. Crick and Leslie Orgel proposed their directed panspermia theory at a conference on communication with extraterrestrial intelligence in 1971, a theory they described as highly unorthodox proposal and a bold speculation, as they presented it as a plausible scientific hypothesis. Crick repeatedly addressed this question and the origin of life between 1971 and 1988. On to number 8, we have the scientist who loved to make 'em dance. In the world of scientists, Giovanni Aldini was a punk rocker with a lip piercing you wouldn't want to take home to mom. At a time when electricity was still a new invention, Aldini traveled across Europe with the sole purpose of electrifying subjects. This may sound horrific, and it was, but it was all in the pursuit of science, as explained by science historian Ewan Morris. He'd spent most of the last decade working to exonerate his uncle, the great Luigi Galvani, who had been dismissed from the faculty at the University of Bologna, hilarious, for refusing to swear allegiance to Napoleon. After losing his position, he died penniless a year later. Aldini's mission was to prove his uncle's theory of galvanism, or the medical use of electricity to stimulate nerves and muscles. And in that mission, Aldini became an entertainer who gave audiences a rare spectacle of witnessing what happens to corpses when they're electrocuted. In a demonstration, Aldini would attach electric nodes to observe how the body reacts. When attached to a human head or an ox head, the facial muscles would contort, the teeth would chatter, the eye sockets even pop out. When the body was involved, limbs and parts moved in motion, giving the impression that the organism was reanimating. Yet, besides his antics, Aldini was one of the few scientists that actually does manage to learn to cure mental illness with electroshocks. His curious and interesting experiments indicated the power of electricity in science. It's in the name, y'all. Number 7 will be Mad Match. We need a lady on the list, and why not do one who may as well have been the Judith Shakespeare, centuries before Virginia Woolf exhorted women to find a room of one's own. Essentially, she wasn't mad, she was just a woman, that's all there is to it. Margaret Cavendish was one of the first women to write using her own name and the only woman to publish her own natural philosophy in the 17th century. And she's also the first woman to be invited to the newly formed Royal Society. Madge was a controversial figure in the 17th century, but despite the scandal her writing life caused, she had a grand total of 13 books ranging from Poems and Fancies, the first book of poetry published by a woman under her own name, to Blazing World, the first science fiction by a woman. She acquired a reputation for eccentricity as well. In addition to her writing, she designed her own clothes, swore like a trucker, and was a friendly flirt despite her very, very loving marriage to William Cavendish, who paid for all of her publications. As a result, Cavendish was often called Mad Madge, but Madge wasn't crazy. As said, she was just a very intelligent woman in an anti-intelligent women era, and maybe a little socially inept. On one occasion, Cavendish was pondering upon the natures of mankind, to quote her, and decided to write down all the positive qualities possessed by one of her friends on a piece of paper, and on another all of her friend's negative qualities. Cavendish then decided to send her friend the list of positive qualities as a kind gesture, which she assumed would be appreciated. Unfortunately, she accidentally sent the wrong list and sent her homegirl a list of her worst flaws. Naturally, said friend was pretty furious. Number 6 is zany and brainy. It's the notorious Nikola Tesla. So, he attended the Austrian Polytechnique in Graz but never graduated, and potentially really was the most inventive and zaniest scientist who ever lived. Some of his saner research included extensive work on AC electrical current and studies involving X-rays. When not producing bolts of artificial lightning that measured up to 135 feet long to kill elephants. If you don't know the story of Topsy, take to the internet or watch the weirdly accurate but also hilarious Bob's Burgers cartoon episode about it. Tesla worked on inventions such as the particle gun that he believed might bring down tens of thousands of airplanes, or anti-gravity flying machines. As he got older, Tesla's OCD condition did worsen and it began to amalgamate with his scientific side more than ever. Mental obsessions are often associated with behavioral compulsions performed according to rigid rules. Tesla felt driven to perform repetitive behaviors such as doing everything in sets of 3, but also developed habits and aversions such as calculating the cubic contents of all the food on his plate before eating, or a touch phobia to human hair. Famously, the renowned inventor believed he had been in contact with extraterrestrials from Venus, and he also managed to fall head over heels in love with a pigeon of whom he insisted felt mutually. And now moving on to the creepiest guy on this list, the brain implant guy is number 5. University of Madrid graduate Jose Delgado may have received a prestigious professorship at Yale University, but his research at the venerable institution's physiology department was, I don't know, the makings of a complete movie level supervillain? Like microchips in the brain, let's control humanity type of vibe. In 1950s and 60s, Delgado inserted electro implants into the brains of primates and used a remote control that gave off radio frequencies to make the animals perform complicated movements in arms, legs, and face. Later, Delgado decided to be even more insane. He implanted this into the brain of a bull, which he then got into a ring with, pissed it off, and then used the transmitter to stop the bull dead in its tracks when it charged at him. Terrifying stuff. Perhaps most alarmingly of all, Delgado also wired up the brains of 25 people. 25 people let this guy in their skull. Behaviorally, this device only impacted people's aggression, but he kept striving for a way to achieve mind control, because as this supervillain once stated, we must electronically control the brain. Someday, armies and generals will be controlled by electric stimulation. And what better way to follow that up than with nymphs and giants? Number 4. Paracelsus, just one name like Cher or Madonna, was a learned man of the Renaissance, earning a doctorate from the Uni of Ferrara in the early 16th century. Seen as the father of modern toxology, Paracelsus was a practicing physician, botanist, and occultist, the latter of which can be given direct credit for his weird stunt experiments. Paracelsus was convinced that he could create a living homunculus, a tiny man, by keeping man juice in a warm place and feeding it his human blood. He even left instructions for any others who might wish to try it, and fervently believed that this method was the genesis of wood nymphs and giants. Science may have been a lot less advanced 100 years ago, but this was still a pretty bizarre hypothesis then. Number 3 was willing to do anything, evidently. It's the Dino Diner. William Buckland, graduate of Corpus Christi College, Oxford, a contemporary of Charles Darwin, remembered as the first man to pen a complete description of a fossilized dinosaur, the Megalosaurus, and an aspiring Anthony Bourdain? If you could eat it with less of an 80% chance of it killing you, William Buckland put it in his mouth. Like the world's craziest oral fixation, this man ate a list that included roast hedgehog, potted ostrich, panthers, porpoises, puppies, bugs, cockroaches, snakes, and even bat urine. children. Garden moles, though, were apparently a bridge too far because they were ugly, so there was no way that could taste good. However, perhaps Buckland's greatest gustatory achievement was reportedly having eaten the shrunken heart of King Louis XIV, a distinction arguably that overshadows his account of the Megalosaurus, if it's true. Number 2 is about these two peas in a space pod. So, the story of rocket scientist Jack Parsons is so monumentally insane that it's tempting to think that Quentin Tarantino is pulling another fast one on us. But somehow, this California Institute of Technology researcher's personal life is real and wildly well documented. The crazy train starts in 1939 when Parsons very suddenly converted to Thelema, a philosophy religion developed by the famed Aleister Crowley. I talked about this religion in the recent Bumblebee video, Historic Sorcerers That Actually Had Powers, if you do want to learn more. Parsons, together with his occult roomies, were spotted many times, nakedly dancing around fires in his garden. And because crazy knows no bound, Jack Parsons went from Aleister Crowley type of crazy to Tom Cruise kind of crazy. Oh yeah, that's right, Jack joined up with Scientology founder L. Robert Hubbard. Why? Oh, you know, just to raise the mother of the Antichrist. Yeah, if you guys don't really know what Scientology is, your favorite celebrities believe in crap like raising Antichrist mothers. Go enjoy Handmaid's Tale now that you know that. So, to raise an Antichrist mother scientifically, of course, because this is science, Parsons yanked his proverbial chain while Hubbard wrote notes on it. A moment of silence, please. Then the pair also believed that they could summon spirits while Hubbard intoned next to Parsons having intercourse with his side piece. And then when Hubbard later absconded with Parsons' side piece, the scientist reported that he was trying to hex his foe. All of this wild malarkey thankfully comes to an end when Parsons was sadly eventually killed in an explosion, but some have suggested that it was actually caused by a magic experiment. And what better way to finish off than with number 1, the Monkey Man. You may be wondering, what could be crazier than Jack Parsons' escapades? Well, Soviet biologist Ilia Ivanov is here and he says to hold his vodka. In 1924, the Bolshevik government granted Ivanov permission to leave the country for the express governmentally funded purpose of breeding hybrid ape humans. So let's go over this again. The government gave a scientist money and resources, and everyone agreed it was to make a half human, half ape. This is real. And then in the summer of 1926, Ivanov, now in Paris, grafted a woman's ovary into a chimp named Nora and tried to, you know, get her pregnant with some injected human man stuff. Sorry, y'all ain't got a better allowable name for it, so just work with me here. In November that year, still being 1926, I'm just gonna keep reiterating times and places because this is real and I'm struggling to conceive that. Ivanov traveled to Africa and put some human man juice into a trio of chimps. None of these animals ever fell pregnant, thank God, and a frustrated Ivanov figured it doesn't work one way, maybe it'll work another. So he changed tactics, instead putting out a notice for Soviet women who were willing to be fertilized with chimp stuff. Something for which he acquired no less than 5 volunteers, of whom I would like to have private conversations with. However, before the experiments could get properly underway, a Stalinist removal of scientists resulted in Ivanov being sent away to Kazakhstan in exile, unable to finish his experiment, where then he died within 2 years of his arrival. Thank God.
Is crossbreeding ethical? I'll let you be the judge. Back in the 1920s, a Soviet biologist named Ilia Ivanov tried to crossbreed humans with various other primate species. He was responsible for groundbreaking breakthroughs with artificial insemination, and with his use of insemination, he was able to use a stallion's sperm to fertilize up to 500 mares. Most stallions could only father like 20 to 30 if you were just doing it the natural way. This made him very popular among horse breeders, who came all the way from around the globe to work with them. He had more ambitions than just horse breeding though, and his interests revolved around hybridization between species. More specifically, Ivanov wanted to see if humans could reproduce with their closest known relatives. So he decided the best route to take with his project was to inject several female chimpanzees and orangutans with human, output. He started his experiments when they were green-lit by the Soviet Department of Scientific Institutions in 1926. None of his subjects succeeded in becoming pregnant, but determined to try again, Ivanov then tried to experiment with human woman and ape, output. However, he wasn't able to put his plans into motion from both opposition from his superiors and the death of his last orangutan donor. Any further tests were prevented when Ivanov was hit by a purge and ended up exiled and imprisoned in what is now Kazakhstan. Also known as the Angel of Death, Dr. Joseph Mengele was an anthropologist and physician who conducted numerous inhumane medical experiments on the prisoners under his watch. At the famous death camp he worked at, he was one of a number of medical professionals who selected victims to be sentenced to the gas chambers or be spared for his experimental research. He would attempt red fluid transfusions from one twin to the other, do amputations to try and sew it onto the other twin, stitch two twins together to form Siamese twins, infect one twin with typhus or another disease, and way too many other experiments. To the surprise of nobody, more often than not, the twins died during the procedures, or he would have them killed afterwards just to do an autopsy. If one twin died from a disease, he would often just kill the other to mark the differences between the sick and healthy subjects. The evil doctor was also very interested in heterochromia, where people have irises of different colors, and he would collect eyes and body parts of his victims and send them off for research. He would inject chemicals into victims' eyes to attempt to change their eye color. He also experimented on pregnant women before sending them off to the chambers, and caused pregnancies between family members, always under the guise of research. He also tried removing and operating on victims without anesthesia. Oh, and if that wasn't all disgusting enough, he tried to prove that Jewish and Romani people were genetically inferior through his morbid experimentation. While he was employed by the SS, Joseph sent his colleagues in Germany red fluids, body parts, organs, skeletons, and even more that had all been taken from folks under his care. Cynthia Crawford was born a fraternal twin with totally different red fluid type and tissue type than her twin sister. Now, unlike her twin, she was born without an amniotic sac, which baffled the medical community. Turns out, prior to her coming into this world, her father had been approached by agents within the OSS to participate in a secret government project. And it wasn't until she was in her mid-30s that she learned from her father that she was a hybrid created in a petri dish by a government program that utilized DNA from two different alien races added to human DNA. Throughout Cynthia's early years, she was taken to underground military medical facilities at night for testing and examinations. And during this time and throughout her life, she also encountered what she believed were alien abductions, examinations, impregnations, as well as miraculous healing and organ replacements. Throughout the 1950s and into the late 1970s, Cynthia tried to seek help and understanding of her experiences, but there were no support groups at that time, and she really couldn't find anybody who would believe her. She was chastised for having and using psychic powers, but her life changed when she gave up fear to consciously face those otherworldly beings. And that's when she learned they were her star family. They awakened her to the truth of her mission that brought her to this planet at this very special time in history. In 2003, Cynthia began making sculptures with the assistance of the various benevolent star beings that she had encountered and that other contactees had experienced. Cynthia dedicated her life to counseling, workshops, and talks, teaching everybody how we're connected to these star people and how to live in an integrated galactic society in the very near future. Sadly, she passed away in 2018, or maybe she just left her mortal body to be with her star family. The first successful human-animal hybrid was developed in a laboratory dish in Shanghai back in 2003. A team of scientists fused human cells in rabbit eggs, creating the embryos of a new creature that was half rabbit and half human. The research, reported by a scientist in China, was fiercely condemned by pro-life campaigners who described it as barbaric. More than 100 of the hybrids are said to have been made by fusing human skin cells with rabbit eggs. The resulting embryos were allowed to develop in laboratory dishes for several days before the scientists killed them to extract embryonic stem cells. These are the body's master cells, with the potential to become any kind of tissue. Experts hope in the future they can be used to grow replacement cells for treating a wide range of diseases such as Parkinson's and diabetes. Scientists in the US have previously mixed human cells and cow's eggs in a similar attempt to generate a source of embryonic stem cells without success. At one point, there was another team of scientists that reported the creation of a hermaphrodite embryo containing male and female cells. The Chinese scientists described their success in an edition of Cell Research. Now, the vast majority of DNA in the embryos was human, but the rabbit eggs contained a small amount of DNA contained outside the nucleus in the rod-like bodies, good old mitochondria, which supply energy. Now, there was a pro-life charity that reacted with disgust at the news. Look, these guys weren't the first people to try it. They were just the first to pull it off. It was unique when compared to other experiments, because the vast majority of the DNA was human. Once again, just a small amount of DNA was taken from rabbits, meaning that whatever came out would have been more man than animal, but the world never got to see what they made. It's one thing to give a pig a human lung, but one experiment blurred the lines between human and animal in a way that no other has. In 2014, a team of researchers gave mice millions of human brain cells. The researchers replaced almost every cell in the mouse brains with human cells, leaving only the original mouse neurons intact. Once inside, the human cells almost completely took over the mouse brains. Within a year, their cells had been completely replaced by the human brain cells. Each mouse had about 12 million human cells at work inside their strange hybrid brains. Now, scientists ran some really horrible tests on the mice. In their main experiment, the researchers played a noise before attacking the mice with an electric shock. Then scientists measured how the mice reacted the next time that they heard the, angry sound. It was very twisted. But it did show the researchers that the memories of those modified mice were 4 times stronger than those of a normal mouse. In 2009, there were scientists in Russia and Belarus who genetically modified goats to produce human milk. They weren't able to make the milk 100% human-made, but they were able to fill it with human cells, creating milk that had 60% of the elements that characterize human milk. And they weren't the only folks who did it. Shortly after, a Chinese team made a whole herd of like 300 cattle that produced human milk. Now, the goal was to get this human milk on grocery store shelves. The scientists wanted a way to harvest human milk on an assembly line. They were kind of positive that people would flock to the stores with a chance to buy a bottle for their family. Heck, the Russian team even advertised that its human milk made delicious cheese. The Chinese team originally planned to have their product in stores by 2014, but a lukewarm reception pushed back their plan. These days, they're just working on convincing the world that human milk coming from a mutant cow is something worth buying. And once they do, you'll be able to pick it up. Zonkeys and Zodonks have been on the market for many years. They were raised by Charles Darwin and are mentioned in his work Origin of Species, written back in 1859. Before Darwin's time, there was a man named Lord Morton who crossbred horses in 1815, and those hybrids existed in captivity for many years. So just so you know, a zonkey is a cross between a zebra male and a female donkey, whereas a z-donk is the offspring of a donkey male and a female zebra. Don't get them confused. These species are intermediate between parent species and contain characteristics from both. So for instance, they possess the straight black and white striping of the zebra, while still having the muscular and stocky body of a donkey. Despite their appearance, they're really fascinating creatures if we're talking behavior. It's pretty obvious, zebras are wild animals, they're very aggressive, and therefore you can't really tame that easily. So the crossbreed of these species also affect the growth of the aggressive qualities. They have some useful features. They have the stamina of a donkey, and once again, the speed and strength of a zebra. This can make them useful work animals that can be used to pull heavy loads. Yes, the utility of these creatures is kind of questionable, and there's more points concerning, such as their ethical creation and imprisonment.
Number 10. Stubbins Ffirth. Stubbins Ffirth was a University of Pennsylvania researcher fixated on one particular scientific scheme, and a very dangerous one at that. As a trainee doctor, he became obsessed with the idea that yellow fever was non-contagious, to the extent that he went to great extremes trying to prove it. Armed only with a trusty blade and his incessant desire to find the truth, Ffirth sliced opened his arms and smeared vomit from yellow fever patients into his wounds. When that made no difference, he poured the vomit into his eyes, drank some of it, fried the stuff, and breathed in the fumes. And in a final act of madness, he covered himself with blood, urine, and saliva from infected patients. Ultimately, Ffirth proved this theory so far, as he didn't get sick. However, we now know that this was as much down to him making samples from the late-stage patients who were past the point of contagion. In other words, Ffirth swallowed infected vomit but didn't shed much new light on the disease. So he did all that for nothing. Number 9. Jose Delgado. University of Madrid graduate Jose Delgado may have received a prestigious professorship at Yale University, but his research was on dealing with mind control. While at Yale in the 50s-60s, Delgado inserted electrode implants into the brains of primates and used a remote control that gave off radio frequencies to make the animals perform complicated movements. Later, he placed the implants into the brain of a bull and got into the ring with the beast using his transmitter to stop charging before it reached him. Aside the animal cruelty, he even tried these experiments on 25 people and wired them up. Behaviorally, it only induced the people's anger and impacted more towards their aggression, but he kept striving for a way to achieve mind control, and even once said, "We must electronically control the brain, and someday armies and generals will be controlled by electric stimulation of the brain." I don't know, I guess it doesn't work. Number 8. Paracelsus. Switzerland Paracelsus' contributions to toxology were based heavily in astrology, and he is quite well known for offering the community a wide array of useful ideas and innovations. He was a pioneer in several aspects of the medical revolutions of the Renaissance, emphasizing the value of observation in combination with received wisdom. However, for all of his use, he also thought he might be able to create a homunculi, or small humans, who stood no more than a foot or so height and performed actions very similar to Gollum. Not Gollum from Lord of the Rings, but pretty close. He is said to have run away after turning on their master. The homunculus creation used bits of people using semen and hair. To him, the fully grown homunculi was supposedly greatly skilled in art and could create giants, dwarves, and other marvels. As though they are art, they are born, and therefore art is embodied and inborn in them, and they needed to learn it from, well, no one. Well, it didn't end up working because they ended up dying right away. Number 7. Peter Neubauer. Clinical psychologists led by Peter Neubauer ran a secret experiment in which they separated twins and triplets from each other and adopted them out as singlets. The experiment, said to have been partly funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, came into light when 3 identical triplet brothers accidentally found each other in 1980. They had no idea they had siblings, and David Kelman, one of the triplets, felt really angry towards the experiment, quoting, "We were robbed of 20 years together," said Kelman in the Orlando Sentinel article. His brother, Edward Gallen, sadly took his own life in 1995 at his home. The child psychiatrist who headed up the study, Peter Neubauer and Viola Bernard, showed no remorse according to news reports, going as far as saying they thought that they were doing something good for the kids, separating them so that they could develop their own individual personalities. As for what Neubauer learned from his evil experiment, that anyone's guess as a result of the controversial study are being stored in an archive at Yale University, and they say they can't actually reveal it until 2066. Number 6. The Burke and Hare. Body snatching was very common in the ages of the pre-19th century, as the only legal way to get bodies for dissection was those of executed criminals. Since it was difficult to get on the waiting list for these bodies, anatomists took buying bodies from the grave robbers or even doing it themselves, up until the students and the anatomists would carry out their own raids in graveyards, acquiring cadavers as and when they could. William Hare and his friends William Burke found ways of delivering fresh corpses to their boarding houses without actually having to steal a body, which is that they would smother more than a dozen lodgers at that boarding house, and then they would sell their bodies to the anatomist Robert Knox, and Knox didn't notice or care that the bodies that he received were recently fresh, as it was imperative to his job. Burke was later charged and died for his crimes, and the case spurred the British government to loosen the restrictions on dissection. The scandal led to the Anatomy Act of 1832, where they made a great number of cadavers legally available for education purposes. Typically, these bodies would be from those who died in an asylum and had no relatives or any ways to cover for funeral costs. Number 5. Sidney Gottlieb. Gottlieb was in charge of the CIA's MKUltra project in the 1950s. This project's goal was to investigate techniques that would crush the human psyche to the point that it would admit to anything. I guess in some ways it's kind of like the truth serum but with psychology. More specifically, he too also wanted to find a way to do mind control like Delgado in number 9. He wanted to find ways with the CIA to induce the behaviors of enemies, but in these cases, Sidney went his way by dosing unsuspecting subjects with LSD, experimenting with illegal drugs, and sought out all sorts of exciting ways to poison people, including Fidel Castro, as he is the man behind the infamous poison cigar. If you guys know Stranger Things, the suspicion of Eleven getting her powers was from her mom being induced with LSD, chemicals that were thought to be creating of powerful abilities, but unlike Stranger Things, it definitely helped open someone's mind up, but not like moving stuff with one's mind. Number 4. Sergey Brukhonenko. Although he's been credited with helping bring about the most important advances with open heart surgery, his gruesome act was on experimentations on animals, also animal cruelty. Sergey wasn't content with slicing up animals after they died. More specifically, not only did he not like to wait, but he also didn't like the animals to die, even after they've been decapitated. In the late 1930s, him and his team undertook a series of experiments as part of which they removed a canine's head and kept it alive away from its body by hooking it up to an air and blood supply apparatus. He would also have another hound had all the blood drawn from its body, only later to be brought back to life by the Soviet Frankenstein. Number 3. Shiro Ishii, a microbiologist and a lieutenant general of Unit 731, a biological warfare unit of the Imperial Japanese Army during the Second Sino-Japanese War. Ishii is remembered as the father of biological warfare. Under his watch, thousands of captives were infected with deadly diseases and thousands more were impacted by chemicals on the battlefield. Ishii performed a bunch of experiments that had nothing to do with chemical warfare, including forced abortions, vivisections, and simulated strokes. Humans were also used as a living test cases for grenades and flamethrowers, and prisoners were injected with inoculations of diseases disguised as vaccinations to study their effects. Because life is totally fair, Ishii was never charged with war crimes, and he died peacefully at his home in Japan in the late 60s. Number 2. Joseph Mengele. Mengele gained notoriety chiefly for being one of the SS physicians who supervised the selections of arriving transports of prisoners, determining who was to be killed and who was to become a forced laborer, and for performing human experiments on camp inmates, amongst whom Mengele was known as the Angel of Death. Mengele was just a stone-cold killer, as he performed experiments on 3,000 sets of twins, and less than 30 survived his depraved antics. His experiments included, but sadly were not limited to, dyeing children's eyes to be a specific color, since he has an obsession with monochromatic eyes, sewing twins together to make them conjoined, and giving them gangrene. In fact, many of his evil deeds weren't scientific at all. He was just masochistic. He was reportedly smiling every time he took part of his selection process of sending arrivals at camps on who were unfit for labor straight to the gas chambers. He died in 1976, and as he was never brought to justice for his crimes. Number 1. J. Marion Sims. Although he was known as the father of modern gynecology, Sims was gained much for his fame for doing experimental surgeries on slave women. Sims remained a controversial figure to this day because the condition he was treating the women, viscogenital fistula, caused terrible suffering. Women with fistulas, a tear between their private parts and their bladder, were incontinent and were often rejected by society. Sims performed the surgery without anesthesia, in part because anesthesia had only recently been discovered, and in part because Sims believed that operations were not painful enough to justify the trouble, which is what he said, but still regardless, the cruelty he bestowed on these women were not at all consented, and manipulated the social institutions on slavery to perform human experiments, which by any standards is unacceptable. Over 200,000 people, or about 1 in 7 prisoners in the United States, are serving life or virtual life sentences in 2019. And over 50,000 prisoners are serving life without a chance of parole, and in many cases from current to distant past, so many were locked up for a variety of crime. Although Arthur Barker was sentenced to serve serve a life sentence, it didn't last that long as much as we thought. Arthur Raymond Doc Barker was an American criminal, the son of Ma Barker and a member of Barker-Karpus gang founded by his brother Fred Barker and Alvin Karpus. Barker was typically called on for violent actions while Fred and Karpus planned the gang crimes. He was arrested and convicted of kidnapping in 1935 and sent to Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary in 1936 as he was killed 3 years later while attempting to escape. Barker was described as one writer, a dimwit and a drunk, who was not much more than a brutal thug. However, fellow Alcatraz inmate Henry Young said that he was determined and ruthless and that once he started on anything, nothing could stop him but death. On August 25, 1921, Barker and 3 other men robbed a woman at a hospital construction site in Tulsa. The 3 men were surprised by the night watchman, Thomas Sherrill. Sherrill was fatally shot when 2 of the men shot at him while fleeing the scene. After Sherrill's family hired a private investigator, Barker and another man, Volney Curley Davis, who worked at the construction site and was friendly with the Barker family, were arrested for Sherrill's death. When he was sent to Alcatraz, and him and his other inmates tried to escape the rough, watery terrain by creating a moat, but unfortunately they were caught on the island. As a result, the guard shot him even though he had died during the recapture. Raymond Kwok Chung Chow was also named Shrimp Boy, is a Hong Kong-born felon with ties to the San Francisco Chinatown Street Gang and an organized crime syndicate, including an American branch of the Hong Kong-based triad Wo Hop To and Hop Sing Boys. In 2014, Chow, with 28 other defendants including former California State Senator Leland Yee, was also indicted for racketeering, money laundering, and a host of other alleged criminal activities. Leland Yee pleaded guilty to racketeering in 2015 in July for conspiring with his campaign fundraiser to defeat donation limits through the money laundering aspect. Despite initial press release, Chow was not indicted in any form of racketeering conspiracy with Leland Yee, as Chow was indicted in a racketeering conspiracy which alleged that he oversaw the criminal factions of the Geet Kong Tong. On January 8, 2016, Chow was then found guilty on all 162 charges, including 1 count of death. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole plus 20 years, and Chow wrote a autobiography entitled Shrimp Boy, A Life of Crime, Violence, and Redemption Inside the Chinatown Underworld, 2013. Albert Henry DeSalvo was an American killer, vile offender, and a suspected serial killer in Boston who was also known and confessed to being the Boston Strangler. And in 1967, DeSalvo was imprisoned for life for committing a series of harm. However, this killing confession that he had made had disputed, and debate continues to which crimes he actually committed. In July 2013, DNA was matched between a fluid found from Mary Sullivan, a victim of Albert, and DNA obtained from DeSalvo's nephew, linking to DeSalvo to the killings of Sullivan and excluding 99.9% of the remaining population. Authorities exhumed DeSalvo's remains later after the month and confirmed the DNA match, although many crimes he's committed, including breaking and entering, was noted, as well as the deaths he was sentenced to lie in prison in 1967. In February of that year, he escaped with 2 fellow inmates from Bridgewater State Hospital, triggering a full-scale manhunt. A note was found on his bunk addressed to the superintendent. In it, DeSalvo stated that he escaped to focus attention on the conditions in the hospital and his own situation. 3 days after the escape, he called his lawyer to turn himself in. His lawyer then sent the police to rearrest him in Lynn, Massachusetts. Following the escape, he was transferred to a maximum security prison known at the time as Walpole, where he later recanted the rest of his crimes, and on November 25, 1973, he was found stabbed to death in the prison infirmary. Robert Wilson, who was associate with the Winter Hill Gang, was tried for DeSalvo's killings, but at the end of the trial, it was a hung jury. Paul Bergeron is an American convicted felon and former criminal defense lawyer who practiced law in Newark, New Jersey. Prior to his conviction, he was known for defending a large range of famous and notorious clients, and he was convicted for conspiracy to killing a witness and other racketeering, illegal puffs, and adult working offenses. The sentences include 6 concurrent life terms in federal prison in 2013, and he was disbarred by the Supreme Court of New Jersey in 2016. A veteran lawyer from the area said the crimes alleged in the federal indictment would make Bergeron the craziest, most evil lawyer in history of New Jersey, and quote-unquote, that is saying something. And a federal court had likened Bergeron's downfall to the plot of a drama, as on March 18, 2013, a jury convicted attorney Bergeron of all 23 counts of which he was tried, including conspiracy to killing a witness and other racketeering and all that other nasty stuff. The U.S. Attorney for New Jersey, Paul J. Fishman, announced to the verdict Bergeron's conduct was stunning violation of his role as an officer of the court and a betrayal to his roots as a member of law enforcement, said U.S. Attorney Fishman. He also quoted that the jury returned the verdict compelled by the evidence and opposed the justice that he had served, as they take no joy of his tragic fall. Bergeron received a life sentence on September 23, 2013. Julianne Buk is an American writer, activist, and widow of the co-conspirator Zvonko Buk, as she was arrested with Buk in 1976 after hijacking TWA Flight 355 and sentenced to life in prison with early parole. She married Zonko Buk in 1972, and they lived together in Austria, Germany, and Ohio before moving to New York City. They were active in publicizing human rights violations in former Yugoslavia and in promoting the cause of the Croatian independence. On September 10, 1976, she and her husband and 3 others hijacked domestic Trans World Airlines flights 355 with the threat of a explosion. While refueling the hijacked plane at Montreal's Mirabel International Airport, officials say that they planted this explosion at a locker at the Grand Central Terminal and gave instructions on finding it. They wanted the news to be out and open and have the American people concerned about Croatia's independence be printed all over the media. But during the hijacking, when the device was found at the Grand Central Terminal, they actually realized after they were being flown over to London that the group ended up surrendering. And turns out that little weapon they had was just a kitchen pressure cooker, so you could say that they were under pressure. Ernest Burkhart was an American killer who participated in the Osage Indian deaths as a hitman for his uncle William King Hale's crime ring. He was convicted for the killing of William E. Smith in 1926 and was sentenced to life imprisonment. Burkhart was paroled in 1937 but was actually sent back to prison for burglarizing his former sister-in-law's house in 1940. After being paroled, Burkhart was pardoned by Oklahoma's Governor Henry Bellman in 1965 or around 1966 for his role in the Osage's death. Hale and his nephews Ernest and Byron Burkhart conspired to kill several Osage people for their head rights after Ernest married Molly Kyle, an Osage herself. Victims of Ernest included her sister's husband, housekeeper, and her cousin, and eventually she also experienced symptoms of poisoning and realized that he was also trying to get rid of her. So she moved away, divorced him, and her children inherited her estate. A warrant for Hale and Ernest's arrest was issued in January 4th, 1926, but for the killings of Bill and Retta Smith. Ernest was apparently apprehended immediately, but Hale could not be found. According to David Gran, Hale later turned himself in wearing a perfectly dressed suit, shoes shine to the gleam, a felt hat, and an overcoat with his diamond-studded Masonic lodge pin fastened to his lapel. Hale maintained his innocence, so federal agents focused on interrogating Ernest, and Burkhart was sent to the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAllister after being found guilty on June 21, 1926. James Joseph Whitty Bulger Jr. was an American organized crime boss who led the Winter Hill Gang in the Winter Hill neighborhood of Somerville, Massachusetts, a city directly northwestern of Boston. On December 23, 1994, Bulger fled the Boston area when he went to hiding after his former FBI handler, John Connolly, tipped him off about pending RICO indictment against him. Bulger remained at large for 16 years, and after 2011 arrest, federal prosecutors tried Bulger for 19 killings based on the grand jury testimony from Kevin Weeks and other former criminal associates. Although Bulger admittedly denied it, Bulger provided information of the inner workings of the Patriarca crime family and his Italian-American mafia rivals based on Boston and Providence, Rhode Island. In return, Connolly, as Bulger's FBI handler, ensured that the Winter Hill Gang was effectively or efficiently ignored. Beginning in 1997, press reports exposed various instances of criminal misconduct by federal, state, and local officials with ties to Bulger, causing embarrassment to several government agencies, especially to the FBI. Bulger's trial began in June 2013, and he was tried on 32 counts of racketeering, money laundering, extortion, and weapon charges, including complicity in 19 deaths. On August 12, Bulger was found guilty on all 31 counts, including both racketeering charges, and was found and involved in 11 killings. As a reward of US $2 million have been offered for information leading to his capture. At 8:20 a.m. on October 30th, 2018, the then 89-year-old passed away. Akoli was born on January 14th, 1937 in Decatur, Texas, and was raised in Vernon, Texas. He then graduated from the Prairie A&M University in 1956 with a degree in mathematics in 19. And this guy was really smart. He was actually studying and becoming a computer analyst for NASA, working for Edwards Air Force Base in California. He then moved to New York City in 1963, becoming a civil rights movement activist before moving again in the summer of 1964 to Mississippi, continuing that new civil rights activism. Akoli was actually radicalized by the assassination of Martin Luther King in April 1968, and in that same year joined the Harlem chapter of the Black Panther movement, as well as its finance minister. He was arrested on April 2, 1969 as the Panther 21 conspiracy case, in which members were accused of planning, coordinating, killing a long-range rifle attack on 2 police stations and education offices in New York City. The group, called Computer People for Peace, raised $50,000 bail for him, but it was rejected by the judge. Akoli and other defendants were ultimately acquitted of all charges in this case, but his status, though, is still granted parole on May 10, 2022, but still currently serving a life sentence. Grant Chernin Amato is an American killer who was convicted of a famicide that occurred on the evening of January 24, 2019. Amato shot his parents and his brother Cody in the head in their home in Seminole, Florida, while attempting to stage it as a self-committed by his brother before fleeing the residence. He was captured after a 24-hour manhunt, put on trial, found guilty, and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The reason? He was so into fanboying for online girl servers, so much to the point that he was addicted admitted to their love and affection that he spent over $200,000 when he was already racking in so much debt and problems, lack of job, nor stability. His family was so desperate for him to get out of his obsession and addictions, they needed to get himself together or they were going to be cutting him off. And considering he wasn't deep into showing his online girlfriend so much love that he could afford it, to his family, to him, they also cut him off from his life. And so the nail in the head was taking Grant to rehab centers, and he couldn't take that. When he felt remorse, Amato responded with, "My family has been blaming me for months for ruining their lives, stealing and not following the rules of their home, so I might as well be blamed for this too." All for an online girlfriend. And finally, the nasty man for sure, a US Army non-commissioned officer named Clyde Lee Conrad, who from 1974 until his arrest on August 23, 1988, sold top secret classified information to the People's Republic of Hungary, including top secret NATO war plans. He was convicted for espionage and high treason in German court in 1990 and was sentenced to life imprisonment. Graduating from Sirbrigg McKinley High School in Sirbrigg, Ohio, he was a member of and letterman in both track and weaponry, and was also known as being quiet and a good student. According to court records, Conrad was introduced to the Hungarian Secret Service in 1975 by his supervisor in the 8th Infantry Division, former US Army Sergeant First Class Zoltan Szabó. Szabó, who was actually convicted in espionage in Austria in 1989, received a 10-month suspension sentence in exchange for assisting the investigation by identifying some of the documents Conrad sold to the Hungarians. It wasn't until he was convicted by the Koblenz State Court in June 6, 1990 of all charges and was sentenced to life imprisonment and fined 2 million marks in order to forfeit all profits from his activities. He died of a heart attack though at age 50 in prison in 1998, and all the Americans convicted of espionage, Conrad is actually one of the only 5 spies to be considered making $1 million for just spying, which is pretty intense throughout all the stuff throughout history. And speaking of history,